Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you all for joining us today. This is our 33rd talk in our series organized by Teachers Against the Climate Crisis. And since some of you are new to our talk series today, let me just point out that Teachers Against the Climate Crisis was formed a little over 3 years ago. And we have, among other things, organized a series of talks in this time. I should also point out, particularly in the current political climate, that the teachers group is non-funded and also not affiliated to any political party. In that sense, we are completely autonomous. And yeah, we've been organized, and we also have over 100 members in different institutes, research institutes, colleges, universities, etc. We are organizing this in what is a particularly exciting time in terms of the energy transition and what's been going on in the last few years in different countries and contexts, catalyzed partly by a dramatic fall in the prices of renewable energies, in particular solar and wind, which has triggered off energy transitions in different countries and places. But I should point out that this is not one energy transition. I've often said these sort of transitions in different countries and very much depending on their own development trajectory, social context, and so on. It's also the case that it raises two questions. One is, how quickly will this energy transition happen? So just to provide context, according to the energy historian and researcher Václav Smil, the previous energy context, which was from wood to coal, took 60 years between about 1840 and 1900. So that raises the question about how quickly the current energy transition, which would be from fossil fuels to non-fossil fuels, and in particular solar, wind, and other non-fossil fuel source of energy, how quickly that would happen. And one role for us as a teachers group and anyone concerned about the climate crisis and related questions is to ensure that it happens as soon as possible. The second thing I think, which is really central and which is something that we also need to ensure, and this has a bearing on the context of today's presentation and today's conversation, is that it needs to be fair and just in multiple ways, as we shall see. And that in that sense also means that it has sort of multiple social contexts in which a transition will take place. The IPCC refers to a just transition framework in its latest Working Group 3 report of last year. It refers to it as a set of principles, processes, and practices aimed at ensuring that no people, workers, places, sectors, countries, or regions are left behind in the move from a high carbon to a low carbon economy. Now, what that sentence makes very clear is that there's no one social context in which the transition might unfold. There are multiple countries with multiple social contexts, multiple histories of working class struggle, and strengths in which a trade union movement might be, and so on. So to discuss these various crucial questions, we have today Sandeep Pai, and he'll be talking about sort of the just transition strategies in different contexts and countries. He'll first narrate the arc of just transition planning globally, outside India, in other countries. It will then go on to explain how the just transition discourse and planning is kind of beginning and growing in India. And finally, his talk will provide insights into how the energy transition in India will impact different categories of workers and what different stakeholders might do to manage this process, transition process. Sandeep Pai is sort of uniquely placed to initiate this discussion. He's been an expert in this area for years, and his expertise spans different areas of energy transition, coal sector, and energy access. His PhD was in fact on sort of ways to manage a just transition away from coal, and he's the author of a book published in 2018 called Total Transition: The Human Side of the Renewable Energy Revolution. He's also returned this as a journalist with Hindustan Times and other places. He's worked on rural development and energy transition in India. I might also add that he hosts a a very fine podcast called the India Energy Hour that focuses on understanding the energy transition and climate policy. I've heard of quite a few of the episodes of the podcast the last few weeks, and they're absolutely fascinating. And we'll put up the link in our chat box in a little while as we go on. So broadly, the before I pass it on to Sandeep, the broad structure of today's discussion is that Sandeep will speak for about 40 or 45 minutes, and after which we'll open it out to the audience and to all of you for questions, comments, your own thoughts, etc. You could put them in the chat box, and if you would like to ask Sandeep the question yourself directly, feel free to speak up. I'd only request you to sort of raise your hand so that we can take it in the order in which the questions come. So thank you, Sandeep, for agreeing to speak to us today with us, and thank you all for joining in. And over to you.
Thank you, Nagaraj, and thank you, everybody, for having me. Um, it's a very interesting time to be talking about this topic. It's a time when, countries around the world, in one form or the other, have made just transition, their one of the key agendas within the larger climate action. And so it's a interesting time of how this field, both academically but also, in different country contexts, have evolved. Hopefully I won't take 40-45 minutes. I would prefer to take shorter, but feel free to, cut me off if I'm taking longer. And hopefully there'll be more time for questions and answers, because that's something that's more meaningful than me just talking. Okay, so with that, let me just start. So, like Nagaraj was saying, like I thought it'll be interesting to provide a global context of energy transition, and within that, how is the just transition playing out, and then provide just transition is not just a coal topic, it's a topic that spans sectors. But to make the talk a little bit more, concrete, and to provide some real examples, I thought it'll be interesting to focus on the coal sector, because that's where most of the work on just transition is happening. So I will do that in reference to the coal sector, and then finally provide some thinking in terms of how one should think about just transition planning in India. What is the role of different players? Again, the last part of this talk is really evolving. It's a fairly new topic in India, and I just want to provide you a flavor of how this is going on and playing out in different contexts. I mean, needless to say, but I think it's important nonetheless to say that climate change is happening today. As we speak, it's not a futuristic topic. It's impacting people and communities today. So there is an urgent need to move away from fossil fuels, which, contribute significantly to climate action. I mean, there's so many reports, including the Intergovernmental Panel Change reports, which really shows pathways to reaching, 1.5 or 2 degree targets. I have to emphasize that, I mean, these are just pathways. This is not, there are other ways to achieve climate, to achieve these targets, but the current pathways that are available shows that, fossil fuels need to decline rapidly. So if we talk about this decline of fossil fuels from current system of coal, oil, gas dependent current system to renewables such as solar, wind, now increasingly talked about hydrogen, etc. The key question is what will happen to fossil fuel workers such as coal workers, their larger communities, the dependent regions, and others, right? So this is the main question. I just want to emphasize before, I present the rest of the slides using this framing. So the framing of this talk is about coal workers, the communities, the regions that depend on fossil fuels. However, I just need to emphasize that just transition also means very different things to different people. So you will have some groups which are only concerned about jobs. They're only concerned about livelihood transition. So they are at the one end of the spectrum. But you will also find other folks who are talking about transformative change. In my experience working in this field for about 7, 8, 9 years, I have gauged that having a very narrow view of just it's about only jobs won't take us very far. Also, having a very transformative view, although as a mission is amazing, sometimes I've seen many of those groups who articulate that transformative mission, which is absolutely required, are not able to clearly state what does it mean in practical terms. So I have come to my own definition, which does not only focus on jobs, but it focuses on the region. So it's somewhere in between this idea of transformative just transition and the just transition, which is only focused on the jobs. So my talk will focus on this the middle of the road definition, and the rest of the talk will follow along. Uh, I also want to emphasize that there is no problem. Other people can have other definitions. If somebody wants to deal with transformative idea of just transition, I welcome them. I just hope that there is more practical action coming out of that rather than just like articulation of that. But having said that, let me proceed with my definition and my context of just transition. Um, so just transition as an idea has been around for a few decades, right? It started with the labor movement in US and Canada, where the trade union movement came together with the environmental groups to say that as industries close, we want to make sure that workers do not suffer, as a result of this. So the idea was to protect workers' rights along with making sure that the environment is also protected. This has evolved over time, and people have adopted in different contexts. But I would say in the climate context, it started slowly around 2000, 2001, where some labor groups started saying that in the context of climate action, we also need just transition and so on. But the real impetus of this topic actually came because of two incidents. The second incident I will just talk about, but the first one is that because of the pressure of labor groups, the environment groups, and some countries, just transition became embedded in the Paris Agreement. And from there on, it has become this topic that every country is kind of, or many countries, not every country, but many countries are now thinking about adopting. They may have different definitions, but the concept of justice and transition is getting embedded in different contexts. So the first, the first importance of just transition is really like to make sure that we don't leave behind people and communities as we move to other sources, other non-carbon sources. But and then there is justice and transition. So from a justice point of view, it's important to make sure that we act on the idea of just transition. But many groups over the years have also argued that look, climate action is immediate. We cannot wait, right? Like we cannot make sure that the last worker is their salary or wages or everything else is managed. We just need to take action. We don't have that much time. So the counter argument to that is like you see so much backlash now these days from communities who have not seen the benefits of just transition, or who are not who are not taken care of. And there's so many examples around the world, but really like when President Trump was campaigning, former President Trump was campaigning for in the previous election, not the 2019 election, but the previous one. I mean, he promised to bring back coal jobs, and he swept across coal states in US. So there is also this political economy question of if you don't manage workers, communities, if you don't make sure that there is just transition for them, they will also push back against climate action. This is not just a US example, from sorry, this is former Prime Minister of Australia, not the current Prime Minister, from Scott Morrison, bringing a lump of coal in Parliament and talking about how coalophobia will take away jobs of men and women. And this really, through my fieldwork, I can tell that this really speaks to communities who are not necessarily against climate action, but they definitely care about protecting their livelihood, which obviously you and I will also do. So there is a lot of pushback. And the most recent one is this very interesting example of how Joe Manchin, a senator, U.S. senator from West Virginia, I mean, he was blocking climate legislations like the Inflation Reduction Act. He was trying to negotiate hard, and a lot of his arguments were to protect, the coal community and the coal workers and the larger region and so on. So whether one accepts this as a justice framing or a political economy question, one thing is clear that just transition as a concept is quite important, even if we want to take climate action. So that's like I talked about the definitions. I talked about sort of like the framing of how that. And by the way, this is the framing even many scholars use. Some use the justice framing, others use the political economy framing, some use both. But broadly, you will find the just transition framing falling between one or two. Um, Now, so after the Paris Agreement, became prominent, and as coal started to decline in rich countries, be it US, Canada, UK, just transition, underlying just transition policy started to emerge. So from 2015 onwards, you had like just transition task forces formed in Canada. And when Biden administration came, there was interagency working group on coal and power plant communities. This is also something happened in South Africa. I mean, this is something that was happening in any country that was staring at a coal sector decline. And some of these task forces report, when the reports came out, that actually also led to some concrete actions. So one interesting example is also that coal power companies also started setting up just transition offices. So Eskom, South Africa's largest utility, created a just transition office, which did a bunch of studies to say that, hey, we can repurpose coal assets, at the same time make sure that workers in communities who are working in those power plants can get retraining and get new jobs and all. And that effort finally led to what is now called Just Energy Transition Partnership between G7 countries and countries like South Africa first, and then it went to also Vietnam and Indonesia, and now there is talk of a Just Energy Transition Partnership with India as well. Although I'm not sure if India will really bite this, but there is nonetheless a discussion about that as well. Um, so not just that countries have set up offices and task force and all, but in many countries these became laws as well. So in Germany you have the Structural Support for Coal Regions Act, which basically talks about all the things we just discussed, which is like making sure workers and communities don't suffer. Colorado has a very progressive legislation in just transition from coal-based electrical energy economy. So I just thought I will provide some examples of legislations passed to incorporate just transition principles. By and large, if you look at all the policies, and we've done some work looking at like kind of synthesizing what are these laws and policies kind of pointing to, like what are they providing support to. So they have usually a worker support policy like skill development, pension support, access to new work, but they also have a community component. Usually there is a fund available to community, to the mayor's office, etc., to promote entrepreneurship, to diversify the economy. Also some funds are available in some context to remediate coal mines. As you know, coal mining regions it devastates the landscape, and it harms the water bodies, etc. So there is also some funds for remediation, because something like a remediation is a win-win, because you not only clean up the sites, but you also create jobs in the process. And so broadly, global just transition laws, policies, action focus on these two set of activities. Um, so I'm just going to summarize this first section in that there is a global arc of just transition planning. I realized this morning that this slide should have been placed differently, but follow it along from the right side. So let's start by talking about implementation countries. So there's three categories of countries in the just transition planning. So there are countries like US, Europe, Canada, UK, etc. where just transition is at quite an advanced stage of planning and implementation. As I mentioned, they have laws, they have set aside money, they have policies, and they are just starting to implement just transition, whether it's about workers, whether it's about communities. The second set of countries would be countries like South Africa and Indonesia, where they have gone through a lot of discussion on what just transition means. So you have unions who have a strong opinion of what just transition should look like. You have environmental groups with a very strong opinion of what just transition should look like. You have companies, you have governments, regional governments. So every player, every key institutional player has an important definition plus action that they advocate, but nothing has been implemented in these countries. So even in and there is strong discussion about what it means. You know, every group puts up white papers and things like that, but there's no like concrete action on the ground, unlike in the implementation countries. Then the third set of countries is engagement countries. I've just coined it as engagement countries, and you can say India and Vietnam truly fall in these countries, where this is a fairly 3 4 year old topic. You know, 4 years back when I was doing my book, when I talked to even like the leading think tanks, researchers in India, they were like, what is this just transition? So it's a really new topic, but I will explain how, even in these 3 4 years, the whole story has shifted, and lots of concrete action are starting to happen, even in the engagement countries like India, even in the last 3 4 years. So that is kind of like the global arc of just transition planning. Obviously, I can answer more questions and cite more examples, but I thought this is a very good, interesting way to understand where different countries are at. Okay. So all this is fine. I mean, but what does it mean in the context of the coal sector in India? And one of the things everybody says is like, look, you can look at any study in India, you can look at any pathways in India. We may desire to have a renewable energy future, but coal is not going anywhere in the next 2 3 decades. In fact, coal is only going to increase in this decade. I mean, any projection, whether you take the projection of the most green groups in the country, or you take the projection of government, or you take the projection of the most people who care much more about energy security, there's no pathway for India's coal sector to decline this decade. So then many people ask, even government officials have asked me, like, why are we talking about this just transition now? It's like this is a topic of the 2030s and maybe even later. Why are we discussing this? So before I answer that question, let me provide the context of what a just transition, what is at stake in the coal sector if we don't plan for just transition? And then I will provide the answer to this question of why it's even relevant today. It's definitely relevant in the future. India has declared a net zero, but why it's relevant even today. So before I begin, I have to acknowledge. Uh, can you still hear me? I see that internet is
Yeah,
unstable.
yeah.
It's
No,
okay.
it's absolutely fine, Sandeep. Yeah.
Okay. Um, okay, sorry. So before I start, I just want to acknowledge and emphasize that although I will be showing you how many jobs are created and all those kinds of things, there is no question that mining and power has massive environmental impacts beyond climate change. Like, I mean, you travel to these regions, from air pollution to, decaying water bodies to like all sorts of different, I mean, there's endless environmental justice issues. And I wanted to acknowledge that because I will not go into the details of that in this talk, given the focus of the talk, but it's important to understand that there is massive impacts of all of this. But having said that, it's also a 200-year-old industry in India, the mining especially, and post nationalization, it's a institutionalized 50-year-old industry. So what has happened because of this 50-year-old industry is that despite all the negative impacts on health and environment, coal has become an ecosystem in about. I'll explain how many districts. I'll provide some numbers, but coal has become an ecosystem in regions where mining and power happens. So the way to conceptualize the socioeconomic ties, I look at three categories of dependencies. So the first category of dependency is the revenues and the social welfare spending. So right from railways, as you know, like Indian Railways subsidizes the passenger and overcharges the coal sector, transport. And that is a big source of revenue for railways, but it's also a big subsidy to the passengers. Millions and billions of passengers who take railway. Federal government roughly gets about 3% of tax, from the coal sector. State governments, six, seven states in India get something between 5 to 12% of their, royalty and different kinds of revenue. Then there is the District Mineral Fund, which came about in 2015-16. So the district government also get lots of taxes and various kinds of things, from the coal sector. And then coal sector in total also, I mean, this is part of a national mandate that, any profit-making company needs to spend about 2% of their CSR in the local regions. And so that's another source of, schools and hospitals and all those different things in the coal regions. So that's my first bucket. The second bucket is obviously it provides direct jobs in, PSUs or private companies. There are also so many indirect jobs, of contractors, transporters. It's an ecosystem, as I was mentioning. There's induced jobs. If you go to coal towns, from barbers to like the induced impacts of direct and indirect, and people who provide, who run restaurants or chaiwalas and all these, the whole economy in many districts are linked to these direct and indirect jobs. And then there is a interesting category of informal jobs, which I will explain very soon. And then in India, there is also the coal sector is structured in a way that there is lots of pensioners. They're not linked to the employee pension fund, but they have their own coal mines provident fund organization. And I will provide numbers of some of these categories, but this is to provide an understanding of the ecosystem. And then, coal is obviously a fuel, it's an electricity fuel, it's coal companies build mixed-use infrastructure in places where they operate. These nice roads. If you travel in Jharkhand or Odisha, which they have built, it's mainly to transport coal, but that road is used by locals and others. And these roads didn't exist before coal mines came. In a lot of coal areas, you'll see that people also have free electricity. It's ad hoc, but in my field work of 10 years on this topic, you'll see so many people receiving free electricity in coal-bearing areas. It's also cooking fuel primarily in Jharkhand and West Bengal, which is the old coal mining areas where people just scavenge coal and use it for their households. So taking this down of a coal ecosystem at national level, I just thought it'll be interesting to talk about it at a district level. So at a district level, it's about jobs and pensions, starting from the left-hand side to district revenues, to welfare spending, to the industrial fuel. Now, when I was writing my dissertation, I had the intention to be able to quantify all of this and kind of provide an understanding of which districts are most vulnerable. But the data is just so hard to collect, especially when you come to induced jobs and informal jobs and the different funds and some of the ad hoc things like mixed use infrastructure. So I ended up collecting data of the boxes that I highlighted in green. So I have data for direct jobs, indirect jobs. That itself took months, and I will tell you about the methodology of how that was done. And then, so for this talk, and for the purposes of what I will explain, the vulnerabilities, etc., the variables were only direct, indirect jobs, pensioners, district mineral fund, and CSR. Obviously, if we have data for everything, the vulnerability will change because it really varies from district to district and regions to. It's a very complicated story. Some districts may have less jobs, but they may have so much, district revenue. So it really, really varies. But nonetheless, due to data availability, I focused on these 4 or 5 parameters and then it highlighted the vulnerability. One thing I would flag is that of all the different parameters that I've missed and is a limitation, the biggest one is the informal jobs. So, and this is especially true in Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, parts of West Bengal where coal exists, where there is a large informal sector where what people do is they scavenge coal. I mean, they have been doing this for 200 years. They collect it and then they sell it in the city. They also use it, as I mentioned, as a household fuel. There is no reliable data, although there is some, ad hoc estimates, but there is no reliable data of how many informal jobs. But from years of field work, I can say there are village after village after village in places like Jharkhand where almost 100% of the people just do this, which is scavenge coal and sell. And there's categories of this. I mean, you hear about coal mafia and all, but so there are individuals who are doing it to all the way to organized people who are selling it. But nonetheless, this is their main source of livelihood today. So with if any energy transition or just transition is not about the direct jobs only, and this we have to think about the informal sector. And the sad part is that there is no representation. Even like in some contexts, some trade unions represent them, but they are not as organized as other sectors, and so on and so forth. And I don't have data for this, but the rough estimates range between 15 to 20 million. That's the number everybody cites. Okay, so having stated my limitation in advance, I will tell you what the result is for the rest of the stuff. So what I did is this data on where even the mines are, where the number of jobs and all these things were not available. So I had to file something like 61 right to information applications. Lots were rejected, but some came. I had to file first appeals, go to the commission, get all this data to even quantify some of the boxes that I mentioned. So it came in thousands of pages. I collected this data set. Some of the data I also got from unions. Some of the data I got from district authorities. And based on compiling all this data, here's some results that I can present. So overall, coal spillover effects are in 284 districts with varying levels of dependency. Obviously, out of these 284 districts, you can even say that 100 out of these 200, 150 out of 284 districts have very little dependency. But about 50 to 100 districts have actually not insignificant levels of dependency. So there are direct and indirect jobs. Again, emphasizing this does not account for informal or induced jobs, which will make this number look much higher. There are about 4 million jobs. There are coal pensioners of about 500,000. Now, the number is going to be 1 million by 2027, according to projections. The district mineral fund of about 500,000,000 is collected in 52 coal districts. And coal companies spend about 144 million running something like 3,500 schools and hospitals and various, not running, but contributing to schools and hospitals and various other things. So all the environmental reality exists, but within that reality, this kind of dependency also exists. So just to provide a little bit more flavor, 43 districts have over 10,000 direct and indirect jobs. And just to emphasize that these are well-paid jobs in many contexts, so the induced impact of these well-paid jobs will, makes the induced number of workers also higher. So you have districts from Dhanbad in Jharkhand to, Paschim Bardwan and various other districts with varying levels of dependency. One thing to emphasize here is that it's the mining sector which is the elephant in the room. Although power plants provides jobs, direct and indirect, but they are a very small share of the overall jobs. It's the mining which also has massive impacts, but also provides direct and indirect and induced quite a few jobs because it leads to creation of townships and it's a much more open-ended thing. Here's 23 districts with over 7 crores of CSR spending. So you have districts like Angul where almost 20 billion, 18, 19 billion dollars are spent, which is about, I think, 100 crores. So there is a lot of CSR money going in a few concentrated districts, especially the mining districts. Um, so I calculated this in various ways using various indexing forms, and I mean, this is one example, and I'll only show one example. But by and large, you would have seen using even all the different methods that I use that the top 25 districts are by and large same. So you have districts from Odisha like Jharsuguda and Angul to districts in Jharkhand like Dhanbad, Chatra, Ramgarh, to even districts in Telangana who are in the top 25. And these districts, you can say that they are high on dependency either for jobs or for revenues or any other parameters that one can think about. So as we think about just transition, it's not just about jobs. You have to think about various aspects, and this is to provide you a flavor of what that could look like. So now I'm gonna try to answer the question which I raised in this section, which is like, why are we talking about this? Coal is not going to decline this decade. So of course, it's an important topic for the future. India has declared a net zero, so millions of workers, their livelihoods are at stake in at least 50 districts which are deeply dependent on coal. I also want to emphasize that just transition is not an overnight process. You know, even in rich countries with very few workers, and so much social security net, even they are finding it challenging to make sure that nobody is left behind. So, in a context like India, where the institutions are not as mature, the capacity, local capacity is poor. I think this is a process. It's a multi-decadal process for a state like Jharkhand to wean itself off coal and not just reach the level that it is today, but also, develop. So it's a process that needs to start now. But regardless of what you think about whether it should start now or in 2030, it's also a now topic. Even though coal as a sector is growing overall, mines and power plants are closing left, right, and center and will close. Because what's happening is industry is consolidating. It is closing all the inefficient and inefficient mines or unprofitable mines, and it is on this at the same time opening large mines which need less workforce. So there is a strong consolidation happening. It's going to close, and according to my back of the envelope calculation, the 293 mines that will be closed, that are closed or being closed in India, sorry.
I would request everyone to please mute your microphones and allow the speaker to speak here. Praveen, anybody else, please mute your microphones on. Sorry,
Yeah.
Sandeep, please carry on.
Yeah, no problem. So I was just saying, like, the scale of just transition, even in the local context today, is comparable to the entire just transition of Europe, according to my back of the envelope calculation, in terms of how many workers will be impacted, even in the short term, as we talk today, as mines, the smaller underground mines are closing. So even today, this is a very relevant topic. Of course, it's a big topic of the future. Um, so, coming to the last and very last part of what I wanted to highlight is like in India, just transition conversations were really driven by research. This is one of those topics where researchers and good research has played an outsized role in pushing the just transition agenda in the policy landscape. So, starting with the assessments like I showed to many think tanks from ranging from iForest to government institutions like IIT Kanpur putting up reports and research on this topic. What has happened is that because of all the research and engagement with stakeholders, Ministry of Coal has formed a just transition division to start to think about what does it mean. Now, their definition right now and their focus is very narrow, which is one of the elements of just transition, which is like how do we repurpose the land by also incorporating people and communities' views. So it's a very narrow focus right now, but nonetheless, again, in the 3 year period, this has been very positive that they have formed a just transition division. I don't know what will happen in the future, but so far, so good. A coal company like Coal India, the state-owned company Coal India, has also formed a just transition task force because the ministry has formed, so they're just following what in the main coal company and also the 9 subsidiaries. Lots of research is happening on this topic. Both at the national level, but also going deep from fieldwork studies to data studies on this topic. So more momentum is building. And something positive happened in that the state government of Jharkhand has also created a task force headed by a retired, PCCF, Principal Chief Conservator of Forest, whose mandate is that in 2 years tell us how do we, as mines and power plants close today and in the future, how do we make sure to provide just transition for the workers? So a lot of exciting things that are happening. It's starting to get institutionalized. Again, these are very early days. Unions have no strong opinion yet on this topic. I mean, they have some opinion now because of the engagement, but not strong opinion. Government has no strong opinion. It's one of those fields where it's just starting. The good thing that has happened in India compared to the West is that so far it has not been politicized. So far, it has been a topic where even the framing is not about anti-coal. The framing is about let's talk about economic development. And that has resonated very well. Because in the West, the framing was always about a coal phase out or fossil fuel down. And that has really divided people, regions, communities, political parties. That framing has hopefully will not come to India anytime soon. So some substantive work can happen. I know this is controversial, but this is my lesson, and so it's been very positive in these 3 years. We hope that there is continued momentum on this topic. So some of the things that these task forces and agencies who I've been advising or been working with are thinking about is using CSR funds for so coal industry is thinking about how they can use their CSR funds for skill training and local job creation. There is so much momentum around like this post mining land use. Like it's not just about that you backfill that mine or you repurpose that power plant, but you actually can you create something useful? Can you create an asset? Can you employ local people and get their input? So there is some work happening in these areas. Also, most coal companies, whether it's NTPCs, whether it's the Coal Indias of the world, they're thinking about diversification, business diversification. Unfortunately, in the first leg of their diversification, they are also going to the western states where renewables are growing. Um, but there is now push within the company also that, hey, can we overlap our business investments even in coal states so that some of those jobs can be retained as coal declines? There's other things. I won't go into the details of every line that is written here, but this is the thinking behind the scenes thinking that's going on within the industry and the government and so on and so forth. Um, so what I thought before I end, I will highlight what should be the agenda for future work, uh, and this is based on like what is happening in India and what needs to happen to push the agenda. So I think the key thing to focus now is not just individual workers, but think about how a state like Jharkhand or a Chhattisgarh or how a coal dependent district in Jharkhand can diversify to low carbon sources. That diversification need not be about solar or wind, which although that could be part of the mix, it could be even sectors like tourism, completely new, cleaner sectors can also be part of the mix. Like so, the idea is how do you completely wean this off? We don't have a lot of great examples from around the world. I'm currently doing a literature review of that, very early days, but I'm struggling to find places that have diversified and well. I mean, it's always that they have diversified, meaning new people have found the jobs created, but the old people are still suffering. Um, it's also important to understand the role of state-owned companies and how they can contribute to the just transition agenda. So that's one level of studies and work that needs to happen. The other is to do more zoom in work on districts to conduct mixed method studies to understand the skills available with workers, what are the future skills, to even to even provide like a district diversification plan and so on and so forth. There is a dearth of work on informal jobs, although some people have done some work, but it's a sector that needs serious attention. And what does it mean for informal workers? Who will represent them? How many even to begin with? Like that's a sector that needs serious attention. And finally, it's not just about coal and coal power sector. It's an ecosystem that also involves steel, cement, brick kiln. Uh, in many of these sectors, the input is coal. So as they transform along with coal, what will be the implications and so on. And I have not written that, but again, just transition is not just about coal. Tomorrow, when the EV revolution will happen or EV sectors will grow, I mean, there will be also decline in those sectors, and we have to also think about it. So it's a larger agenda of making sure, that people and communities are part of this transition and not outside the transition. There is absolutely no question that energy transition is a must. There's also no question that it will bring massive benefits from clean air, cleaner cities to jobs. But there are also going to be large swaths of people and communities who will lose as a result of this transition. And the whole idea of just transition is to apply principles, planning, and action to mitigate any harm to those people and communities that will be impacted. Thank you. I will stop there. I don't know how am I doing time wise, but I think
You're
those
doing,
were
you're doing absolutely fine. You're absolutely spot on. Thank you. And
okay.
also,
I will stop sharing my slide
for,
and then we can
okay,
chat.
yeah, sure. Yeah, no, thank you for what was a fascinating and sobering presentation. Absolutely scintillating. It's such an important one. I'm so glad. I'm also glad that today, among our audience and those who have joined us today, we also have some members of trade unions. So I look forward to their thoughts as well. So please feel free to share your thoughts. I'm going to just point out, I'll just open it out to all of you. You could put in your questions or thoughts in the chat box. Also, you could just feel free to come in yourselves and share your thoughts verbally and ask Sandeep question yourselves. Please feel free to do so. Before we start off, I'll just I have just one question myself, Sandeep, actually where you ended, which is to some degree, it's maybe outside both today's presentation and your research work, but one huge area actually is where you ended, which is the transport, vehicles and automobile sector. So I actually live in Delhi, as you know, and nearby in Gurgaon, Faridabad and surrounding areas, literally have tens of thousands of workers in these industries, both in the automobile industry and in the auto parts industry, who will all be probably pretty massively impacted as we move towards electric vehicles. And that may actually happen faster than coal. Because my lay understanding is that an electric vehicle, particularly electric car, has far fewer parts, far fewer moving parts than a car made with an internal combustion engine. So I was just wondering whether you had any thoughts to sort of elaborate where you ended your presentation, because you've sort of
Uh,
had so many fascinating podcasts in your podcasting. I'm sure you've had conversations with your studio. So to just share before
I
we
mean,
open up.
it's a question. So there is some research starting on other sectors, non-coal sectors, but there is really dearth of understanding of how it will impact other sectors. I mean, even in coal, there is, as I highlighted, there's so much gap, right? So there's quite a bit of dearth. I am starting to do a project in Uttar Pradesh to look at this very question of how an EV, all EV UP will impact the jobs and stuff. But I really don't have a strong answer to this. I mean, just to say that according to various statistics, mostly from the West, it's clear that you only need one-sixth of the workers in the EV industry compared to the normal, industry. I mean, it's also not about that. I mean, think about all the dhabas in India, right? Like they rely on this trucking and also there's a lot of questions. I think one has to think of it this create this ecosystem like how I was describing the goal and think and quantify and see the impact. But I'm sorry I don't have a research oriented answer rather than just to speculate that there will be impacts. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's fine. You sort of open out the conversation about it. That itself is an important starting point. I notice that Raghuram has raised his hand. Others, please feel free to do so. He's coming after Raghuram. Yeah, Raghuram, please.
Thanks, Sandeep. That was quite a useful estimation of the scale of the problem of transitioning away from coal. It's easier said than done. That's very obvious. But assuming that we accept living with coal as our situation for the next 2 or 3 decades, what would be the least unsustainable? Because I can't say what is most sustainable about coal. So let me take the reverse approach. What would be the least unsustainable way of, during this transition period, what are the few things that we can do to minimize the environmental damage, to maximize the social mobility into other, options, and also to improve the or reduce the inequity gap, even in the existing system that we already have. To begin with, maybe you could think of 1 or 2 of these. We're all talking of coal in the context of carbon reduction targets for net zero. But we also know that greenhouse gases are not just carbon dioxide or carbon, which includes carbon dioxide and methane, but a whole lot of others. And there are technologies available even in the existing coal-based energy sector that mitigate and reduce many of the other, pollutants that come along with carbon dioxide. I don't know about methane, but it should be, and carbon monoxide, but it should be possible to, there are techniques already available to reduce NOx. US and Europe have reduced their NOx emissions from the same coal technologies by up to 30% in the last few decades. And one can reduce organic compounds, benzenes, and various other compounds that seriously impact our health. To what extent are these at least being pursued in the existing coal sector in India to minimize all the other pollutants, if not carbon dioxide, let's at least minimize everything else for which we have the mechanisms and technologies. Maybe the costs are an issue, but one has to find a way to deal with that. Do these become a part of this, least unsustainable pathway to transition while we live with coal for the next couple of decades, if not more?
I mean, it's a very, very good question, and it's a hard one. It's a very good question because, as you said, like we have to, like I think communities will have to find a way to live with it for a bit. Although the pace of transition is always unpredictable, um, there's no question that these things should happen, right? Use the latest technology, be it for making sure that the land is remediated well, to make sure that all other gases are captured and all. Or even like starting with having a washery, right? Half of the coal in India is not even washed before using in the power plant, and there's so much dust. And I mean, so there's all sorts of impacts. Whether the question for all these coal companies today is like, and there are some mandates here and there. I'm not an expert on all the different mandates that are there, but there are lots of different mandates that install flue gas and various things. But I mean, there's been reluctance from the coal companies in various contexts to not do this because anyway coal is facing pressure from renewables in terms of cost. So I think cost is a big barrier to doing that. Somebody had interestingly raised, I think, I don't remember who, that to exactly speaking to your question, that in this period where India will have to live with coal, can West subsidize or somebody else provide climate finance to make sure that we use cleaner coal, as clean? When I say cleaner, meaning like cleaner for environment, health, etc. But I don't think that argument has gone forward. Just to summarize your point, I think this is very important. I mean, I think we should, if we have to burn coal, we have to burn the cleanest coal, clean for everybody. But whether that will happen in the real world is an open question.
If I'm allowed a little supplementary on this, I put a message in the box.
Yeah, sure. Why don't you ask that? Yeah.
Nitrous oxide is 265 times more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. Even NOx which is one of the largest nitrogenous emissions from coal burning after carbon dioxide. NOx also is at least 10 times a higher global warming potential than carbon dioxide. So every gram of NOx emissions saved will give us 10 times carbon equivalent saving. Every gram of nitrous oxide saved gives us 265 times carbon equivalent savings. Are we even looking at carbon equivalents, or are we stuck with carbon dioxide more as an excuse for doing nothing? This is really my main concern when I consider this whole slogan of living with coal. Is living with coal an excuse to inaction, or is living with coal a very determined pathway for transition, as a part of which we are addressing all the other addressables first, including nitrogen, sulfur, etc., before we are able to come to the carbon? Are we at least doing that? That's my main concern.
I think there was more a comment. I'm just wanted a response from Sandeep.
No, I
Sure,
mean, I have the same answer. There's no question that this should happen, but it's not really happening. So I don't know what to contribute there. Yeah, beyond saying that this should happen. Yeah.
Yeah, Shavik,
but at the level of government, do you think that this is more of an argument to justify inaction on coal than a serious commitment towards a just transition?
I mean, there is calls for, taking action on every aspect of this, but I'm not sure how much traction it is getting at the government level, because they are, one of the challenges in India is like ministries also work in silos, right? Like, even though they are part of the same government, coal ministry has the mandate to produce coal cheaply. Power ministry has to mandate to make sure that the power is cheaper. And so in this game of everybody trying to do their best, um, uh, I don't know if these issues are coming up. As far as I know, I mean, I don't know everything. Maybe there's something happening, but I'm not aware.
Yeah, Shavik, please. After Shavik, Ashutosh. Yeah. Shavik?
Sandeep, for the fascinating talk and doing a very important research on this topic. So congratulations. And also, I had one observation and a question for you, because that's keeping me very worried for a long time. And I really don't have the right answer. I have not found a good answer for it. One is that the observation is that I think there are now scenarios which are being made by many reports, even international energy agencies and all. They came up with this in India's Energy Vision Outlook of 2021 recently, which was published in 2022, where they are showing scenarios of coal usage going down over the next decade. So many of us who worked had an assumption, like you rightly said, that coal usage won't go down. But now there are a lot of reports, especially because of these advantages which has come up with the renewables, that coal demand will actually in the sustainable scenario, a sustainable development scenario, which they call, will go down for almost by more than 25%, like from 600 or maybe more, in fact, 600 million tons of coal equivalent in 2019 to around approximately 450 million tons of coal, which is a lot, I think, by 2030 in their international in this energy outlook. So they are actually, because even in our way of thinking, we actually thought that it would be, like you rightly said, that it would be very difficult for Indian economy over the next 10 years to contract coal. But of course, if the business as usual scenario goes on, there will be expansion of coal. Like we are, Naga and others, some of us in West Bengal they are trying to actually open up more coal mines, like you also mentioned, like because they are not taking any of this seriously. But this was one observation. So I think this scenario is changing, where in modeling they are reducing coal absolutely, even they are making it almost like half.
Can I just, before you make the second point, sorry, maybe I have missed this report, but like I just don't understand how, like, unless this is a scenario where the output of the scenario is net zero, and so like it's not a scenario where based on current policies, it's a scenario based on like, oh, if India were to achieve a net zero, or if the world were to achieve a net zero, then they are trying to say that then India needs to have a coal reduction. Is it that kind of study, or is it a study where it's based on the current policies? Because I will be shocked if it's based on current policies. The government
No,
of India's own.
of course, like on the basis of current policy, like business as usual, what we call, actually they have three scenarios. One is called steps, one is the sustainable development, like with the climate goals, and the other is the IVC. So of course, like if it's the business as usual scenario, then we see an more expansion of coal rather than a contraction. But if you look at the sustainable development scenario, which, like you said, like even Modi's government is also talking now about we need to do something, especially in India. Fortunately, that thing has not still yet started. It started in the US, Trump and everything saying that, oh, climate change is almost like they openly say it, right? Like climate change is a conspiracy theory. China,
Yeah.
So that politics, fortunately, has not entered till. So in that scenario, of course, like they are thinking, but earlier those modeling, even though sustainable development modeling did not have that, because they thought that coal will remain the same. But I think what's happening is with cost reduction, it's So my question is more fundamental. What keeps me worried is this, and this I think you also mentioned, and in countries like Indonesia, or even in India's case, along with or in Colombia, many of these countries which are dependent on fossil fuels and also export, like Indonesia is a huge exporter of coal to the global economy. Now, many of their welfare fundings in their sectors which have, it's not only about the question of jobs or anything, but they're welfare related, like they're spending on health, education, is actually related to the fossil fuel sector. Now, even a student did a PhD student, he worked on Colombia, and even there I saw that for their social sector expenditure is very much related to the export of oil, of not coal. And in Indonesia, I know for certain, and even in India's case, as you were telling, that many of the things like railway passengers, tickets, there are other welfare expenditures of public sector enterprises which might be related to the welfare spending. Now, what worries me is like if this sector goes down, and it will contract in all possibilities given the dangers. How do you see that this welfare spendings can be like how can this sector contract without the welfare spendings not contracting? This is something, if you can just
Yeah.
help us in thinking out, like.
Yeah, it's a very good question. So I'm not sure if I can provide an answer of 1:1 of how if this declines and that will happen. I think one of the things I'm seeing in the literature, but also in practice, is the question of, say, let's take one district as an example as a unit of our example. So just so it's more practical. So let's say a district like Ramgarh in Jharkhand, right? Say Coal India is spending 10 crore rupees. They're running 10, 15 schools and all the different things. The social sector is coming as an example. Now, what would be ideal is that as coal declines, some other set of industries come here, right? Whether they are run by Coal India or some other new player, uh, that's a different story. But like the idea is that the whole economy of Ramgarh is now oriented towards the new set of industries, and I don't think it can be one industry. It can't be one-1 replacement. It's definitely can't be a solar or a wind. Right? It has to be like a mix of cluster of industries. So the ideal goal would be to, as one is shrinking, the other set of industries grow. And as they grow, maybe they also start spending on CSR, maybe even more, and maybe provide jobs and maybe do all the keep running the schools and hospitals. So that would be one model of doing it. And that is a model we are actually doing a study in Ramgarh and to actually understand this very question of what are the 6, 7 new industries, allied industries, non-polluting industries that a district like Ramgarh can diversify into, and see that this coal ecosystem is not only maintained but also more jobs are created. And so we'll create a few scenarios to think about, okay, if they're contributing this much today, if X and Y and Z industries come, they'll pay this much tax, etc., etc. It's a work in progress, but that is one way that is the one way I can think of how you can manage the drain of social services or welfare schemes. I don't know if that answered your question. So that diversification, basically.
Yes. No, that was a very good way of thinking it. And are these solar and wind public sector enterprises or like they're private? Because I think
So,
private,
yeah,
it's very difficult.
it's
Anyways, I don't
difficult.
want to take anyone's time. Like,
No, but it's a very good point. Unfortunately, most of the renewables is now in private hands and in Western and Southern India. Most of it. I mean, not
Yeah,
all. And the
mostly
coal
correct.
belt is very different from. So that is, and that's why I also emphasize even a company like Coal India is, although making coal, generating coal in like Eastern and Central India, even in their current diversification plans, they're going to Gujarat and Telangana, Gujarat and Karnataka and all. So the idea is also to, I mean, these are anchor industries, the Tatas or the Coal India. If they also don't invest in these states, I don't know which new player will invest, right? You need capital. So yeah. So you're right that private industries will become even more difficult to do all these things. So to me, and I'm very vocal about it, that to me, it's good for India's just transition that PSUs are in charge of the coal sector decline. I mean, I'm not saying they're perfect. There are all the issues and inefficiencies, but nonetheless, you can at least push them around to do something more than private companies.
Ashutosh, please come in, and before you ask your question or comments, feel free to share your thoughts. Please also introduce yourself.
Yeah. Thank you, Sandeep, for the wonderful presentation. It gives us a lot of good information for me also. I'm basically working for a trade union organization, Industrial Global Union. We have around 2 affiliates in the coal sector. One is affiliated to INTUC and another is affiliated to HMS. So we had several rounds of discussions with the unions. What is their role in the just transition? But the problem is the policy. The government policies are still not very clear. Like as you know, that Coal India is in 2024, the coal production is increasing according to the government policy, 1 billion tons. Yeah. And they are talking about the net zero, they are talking about these policies. And on the other hand, now the commercial mining is allowed. For example, Coal India has, because I also worked in a Coal India, my father was working in a Coal India. We had a history of coal industry. So we know Coal India का एक structure है, CSR बोलिए, welfare बोलिए, because they are investing a lot in the welfare of the workers, hospital और ये सब. ये commercial mining में तो नहीं हो सकता. It is not possible. Now after 90s, there is no job for the permanent worker, except dependent के अलावा उनको नौकरी नहीं मिलता है. So around 2.5 lakhs workers are still the permanent workers, but they are in the verge of the retirement. Yeah, and they are replaced by the commercial, like the contract workers, different types of contract workers. But their wages, their social security, their health and safety issues huge. So we had a discussion with our unions to how to what could be the demands and आपके unions की तरफ से क्या, because we feel as a point of view union in the coal industry, Coal India में अभी भी जो unions है, they are strong enough to, at least they have voice, they have a strong voice to the ministries, because एक structure है. Yeah, but so we are working with our unions to what could be the demands. And recently, in just I think last month, we had a discussion with because their national coal wage agreement is due. So the INTUC and HMS unions joined together in a meeting, and we discussed what could be the demands of the unions in terms of their policies and this part of it. This is basically the coal, but just transition is not only the coal. Just transition is, the whole supply chain is an issue for what Comrade Nagaraj already mentioned. It affects in the auto, it affects in the cement, it also affects in the steel industries. So I can tell you some examples of this cement sector, because cement is also very dependent on the coal. Recently, we had a meeting with the unions on just transition and the technology changes in the cement sector, and they said now around, because in the kiln, if you talk about the process of there is one kiln. In the kiln earlier, the coal is a primary like raw material for the cement sector. But now they are exploring the possibilities of AFR, like artificial, fuels and like this thing. But the problem is the AFR is also not creating a new problem for the workers, because they dumped the city ka jo kachra hai, and they dumped all these things to the kiln, and it creates a new problem. It creates a new issue for in terms of the just transition. So coal अभी उन unions के पास भी ऐसा या बाकी जगह भी, because in cement industry this is predominantly the private sector groups, and more or less contract system is very high in that. So how to articulate, how to mitigate these issues, this is very important. So as a union point of view, we continuously ask that the basics, the social dialogue with the stakeholders is very important. Stakeholders engagement is very important in any kind of change. Then we can say that this is a transition with justice, And we also emphasize that creation of what you said also, the creation of local inclusive structures. Otherwise, one segment, alienate ho jayega, dusra segment aa jayega. And where the contract system is increasing drastically in India. In coal, you are talking of in cement, where 80% contract workers are there in coal. This is the official figure, not my figure. According to Coal India, around 60% workers, 63% are the outsourced workers. So this is very challenging for us. So CSR, in point of the CSR, they are doing so much, this type of funds. But क्या वो real में effect हो रहा है क्या just transition? It is a big question for us. So this is what I feel. Trade unions participation is very important. The level of, the another issue, the level of the workers' knowledge about the just transition in the supply chain,
Right.
in the mining, in base metal, in other cement sector is very low. Is very low. So this is very important, which we feel. Thank you so much. So
No,
this
I
is
mean,
more or less more comment, I believe.
No, it's great.
Then-
I have one thought on this, and I think going forward, it's very, very important to like people who know or think about just transition to engage deeply with trade unions. I mean, I think trade unions are sitting as a very important stakeholder between workers, communities, and the government. And so it's important to not only sensitize but also solicit ideas of
Yeah.
how you can like both the process of starting to even talk about it, but also get, hey, how do we shape this? How do we move forward? But I mean, as you mentioned, like the awareness levels, barring a few leaders and few people like you, like people don't know anything about what
Yeah.
is this just transition and also. So, but just on a positive note, these are early days, right? This is a 3-year-old topic in the country. I have no doubt that by in the next 2 years, given all the landscape of research and engagement that is happening, I have no doubt that this topic will penetrate more deeper and deeper. Now, what will be the outcome of that? I don't know. It depends on the framing and how the engagements are done. But I have no doubt that the awareness will increase. Like 3 years back, not one person knew about this, like in the coal industry. But the game is changing, but obviously it will take its own course.
But the economics is changing very fast. We have to like our trade unions and should also be, actively involved in the process. Otherwise, we used to say we should be on the, we should not be on the plate. We should be on the board. Otherwise, how we can react, So this is very important for us. Actually. And
Just
this is
bringing up
not the
others-
issue of only the coal. Coal is only one, one sector, but the just transition is it has a huge impact in the other sectors like steel, cement, and other sectors.
Yeah.
Thank you so
Yeah, I
much.
think that point has been made. And I'm also like Sandeep, if I've understood him right, I'm also a little skeptical of Shauvik's point about coal declining by 2030. I really don't see that happening, to be honest. There were a couple of things, if you have the time, Ashutosh, to clarify about the level of mechanization, how that's impacting jobs in coal mines and coal plants particularly. So what are some of the questions in the chat box? Anu Varghese has a broad question about, she says how she'd like to know how the industries change into non-coal based and do we really have a system to transit into renewable energy? There's a slightly broad question that maybe you can respond to before we take any others.
The question is, I can read the chat, but I'm getting
it goes
lost.
up in the chat box. She's asking, she'd like to know how the industries change into non-coal based. Do we really have a system to transit into renewable energy?
I mean, the coal industry itself is going to change slowly, but the country as a whole is moving towards renewables. But the idea should be that the coal industry also, moves to the renewables and hopefully moves in the same region, not in different part of the country. And so, yeah, I think the reality is that the transition will happen. I mean, I have no doubt about it. I'm very optimistic about it, but the pace is a question mark, and and how in that process can we move to cleaner sources? It's not just renewables, there's a whole host of clean sectors that one can think about. And so, yeah, I have just to reiterate that yes, I think it needs to move and it needs to move fast, and hopefully the coal industry and coal areas will also benefit from the clean energy transition. Nagaraj, I think you're muted.
I'm sorry. Interesting question from
Naga, Naga?
Yeah,
Hello.
Prabhu.
Yeah. Can I ask a question related to this?
Okay, sure. Come in. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, please. If you don't
Sorry?
mind, yeah. Please come in, Prabhu. Yeah.
Can I? Okay.
Yes, please. Yes,
No,
please.
no.
Prabhu.
I was wondering this particular question. I'm sorry that I've joined very late, but I'm with my comrade who's Asutosh, perhaps, who talked just now. I
Prabhu,
wanted to ask.
please introduce yourself, please, Prabhu.
Hello, I'm Prabhu Mahapatra. I teach history at Delhi University. Sandeep, your talk was extremely, well, from the bit that I heard, I was really impressed, and the way you have, I like the structure that you have. I just have a question insofar as the impact. Let us not think only of the impact on workers. Let's look at the trend that is happening within the coal industry, which Ashutosh just pointed out. If 60% jobs are being outsourced and privatization and so on and so forth, contractualization, that provides two kinds of issues. It provides a kind of a disincentive for transition. That means it is a kind of positive subsidy towards coal expansion on the one hand. And second, what it does is it lowers the benchmark of welfare, which would be necessary in order to generate new jobs, or so-called in the just transition. So that means before we make the just transition, our standards are being lowered, so that the requirements will become then, okay, now we are calculating on basis of say 2% or 3% CSR of the PSUs. It will become less and less,
Right.
insofar as so there is a kind of, it's not only to think of if the existing trend towards the type of jobs or which exists within these industries, if that continues even in the thing, it has this double impact, I believe. And it in fact is a disincentive for transition. That means acts as a barrier. And even if it happens, then it will also lower the level of, that's my feeling, that it will level the lower of a benchmark will become lower. If you have more precarious jobs being the trend, even as it is happening within living with coal scenario. So I'm worried about that. We have been, I think, too much thinking about impact on workers rather than looking at the work relations which are shifting and changing, how they will impact the course of transition itself.
Right. No, I mean, it's a very valid point. It's a very valid and great point, and something that concerns me also, that, how, like, as the standards are lowering even today, so it becomes, then, the future just transition becomes kind of like a thing where you don't have to raise the level because the levels were already down when the thing had. And that's a trend that's happening. And I know that Ashutosh can attest to this, that unions have been fighting this, but the government is and the companies are quite keen to go this outsourcing route because it saves them money, and then they have more control over the industry and all that. It's a very worrying trend in that it will have implications on just transition and the overall welfare of how just transition is done. So yes, fully agreeing with you on that.
Now, Sandeep,
Okay.
just to follow up, just one point, that in that sense, the unions struggle to retain the quality of jobs, even though they may not, the quantity may be reducing, but to retain the quality and standard of the jobs can become a very good point for the, as an incentive, as something which actually helps the just transition process. So that means that is a kind of that should become the struggle to retain the quality of jobs. Okay, even in the living with coal scenario, there should be a struggle. That struggle, I think, will resonate very well with the workers, and it can become a way of saying that, look, this is the path towards just transition. And I feel that's the way we can interact with that. Only thinking of costs from the standpoint of the is important, I think. But I think if we look at quality and the workers, if the unions would resonate on the, they will have a greater stake in the just transition.
Like to respond, Sandeep, or should we move on to the question from Devavati? Yeah.
Oh, I'm muted. It's a very good point, and I can only agree that's a role of unions that they can play on this. And this is a very legitimate point. I don't think I have anything to add here.
Devavati, would you like to come in yourself, or should we go from the chat box? You want to ask the question yourself?
Yes, sure. So my question is that, I mean, some of it has already been answered. A lot of conversation has happened here regarding trade unions, but my question is also regarding whether you see planning happening as a centralized mechanism, or what is the role of decentralized planning here when it comes to just transition? And do you see any hope for collaborative action between the state and civil society?
It's again a great question. So far, the just transition, even though positive that India is even thinking about it, has been very top down. Um, it's and partly it's also a challenge of awareness. Um, so it's always a tension between like how do you make people aware about a topic, um, without involving the state and also. So think about it this way: when researchers were researching about this topic, right? They can go to community and all the different communities, but I don't know if any group has that much resource to make people aware about the transition, and because people are thinking about their day-to-day lives, right? So the natural choice for research community was to go to the government and say that, hey, let's do, involve, this is just transition and you should think about it. And so, as the government processes in India are, like a Ministry of Coal forming a just transition division or a Jharkhand task force forming a just transition, it ends up being very top down. Now, there is a lot of demand from these actors to make it more inclusive and make it really like bottom up. But that has not played out well. Um, that has not played out well for me to say that whether there has been participatory justice or not in that aspect. But yeah, I agree that this has been top down, but it's also a question of how do you make very local communities aware about this topic and start that process. Like, who has that resource to start that process? I mean, we can blame the government, but like, how can we do this? I struggle with this question, right? Of the idea of like make it participatory, that's the end goal, but how do you actually do it? Who will set aside resources for this? Like, how do you make it bottoms up? But yeah, so far it has been top down. I know I'm going in circles, but it has been my struggle as well on this topic.
Yeah.
No, thank you.
We are pushing Sandeep for time. Sandeep, we have a couple of minutes, 5 minutes. I'm not how much time you have. Because we got quite a few questions from Barbara, who was unfortunate to leave. But if
Okay.
you know box, there are quite a few very interesting questions that she's asked,
Uh,
factual and conceptual. So the only way
yeah.
a brief response before we wind up and let you go. If
Okay,
you're
so
there.
should I look at her questions and try to respond?
Yeah. So yeah, if you could, yeah.
I,
So if
I'm
you,
I'm gonna your systems are pro essential. Are there controversial varying degrees of interest at stake in expanding approach to livelihoods?
just answer briefly about what you can given the time constraint.
Right. So, I mean, yes, there is different, as I mentioned, like it really varies from district to district. Who is there? I mean, some workers are more entitled than others. There's a whole host of issues. This is just a consolidated number that I presented even at a district level. But there is obviously like, there's different levels of, contradictions and interests and all. I mean, some workers suffer from health issues, but also are dependent. So there's all sorts of issues, yes. So that's our first question. Spillover results involved 4 million. Are these formal or informal? So this is the definitional question. So formal and informal is one way of categorizing this, but I choose to categorize in terms of direct, indirect, induced, informal. So these are mostly formal jobs, but Although some people also consider contractual workers and informal, but these include the contractual workers, the 4 million jobs. The third, registered. Later you mentioned. So the 15 to 20 million that I'm talking about are the 4 million plus the informal, according to my definition, people who scavenge coal, and that's the number I mentioned. Okay. CBA is actually used in politics. Okay. Fourth, politics
So,
policy.
yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, Nagaraj, you were saying
Yeah,
something?
I'm sorry. Don't feel pressure to answer all of them given your shortage of time. But
Right. I think the last question is quite like big for me
yeah,
to speculate. So I think we can take that up later.
yeah, I think we can also continue this conversation within TACC, and I think there's a very dire need for us to do so. I think
Right.
Mayank, I'm sorry for shortage of time. Let me request you to carry on your put a question to Sandeep, either or email or later in the TACC chat box. So I just like
I'll do
to
that. I'll do that.
say, yeah, thank you, Mayank. I'm sorry about that. But I just like to say, Sandeep, thank you for an absolutely fascinating conversation. I think this is probably the first time the ACC has had 32 talks before this. I think this is the first time that we frontally discussed the question of a just transition, and in particular its impacts on different categories of workers, and particularly in the Indian context. I'm extremely glad that this took place today. And I hope that this is the first of many conversations to come, both from you and from other members and beyond, to have this conversation within TACC. I think it's an exciting, this is something very clearly from is something that is going to carry on for years. It's only, like you said, it's only a start. It's only been 2 or 3 years. It's something that's going to carry on for a very long time. I do hope that we are able to carry on this conversation in TACC and beyond, and make it wider, and also engage with trade unions and others as part of the conversation. I think it's a very important facet of the climate change landscape in India that I think we need to be engaging with more as people who are concerned with this question. So I'll thank you once again, Sandeep.
Thank you.
Thank you
It
all
was great.
for joining in today. Yeah. And once again, I'll just urge all of you to listen in to the podcast that Sandeep co-hosts. It's absolutely fascinating. And I will split the link on that too, and so on. So thank you. Yeah. Thank you all for
Thank you.
joining.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye all.